Everyone, my name's Katie Earle. I'm from Erie County Department of Senior Services, and I'm the coordinator of the University Express program. I'm joined here virtually with Angela Keppel. She'll be our instructor today, and please bear with us as we walked through this and we learned together about this platform and about her presentation. I would like to thank the sponsors of University Express, my Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans because they help make this program possible. And if you ever have any questions or need any resources or support, please don't hesitate to contact our Department of Senior Services. We're happy to help however we can. We have great programs and we work for you. So our general phone number is area code 716-858-8526. Okay, let's learn about Angela today. Angela Keppel is an urban planner and history enthusiast. She's a lifelong Buffalonian. She lives in the juxtaposition between where we've been and where we're going as a city. She runs Discovering Buffalo one street at a time, where she blogs about Buffalo streets and how they got their names. She works as a project planner with Buffalo Place, which is the downtown business district, and I will turn it over to Angela. I'm just going to take away my video so we can be focused on her. All righty.
Thanks, Katie. So as Katie said, I'm Angela Keppel. I was born and raised in Buffalo. I work as an urban planner. I've always been really into history, spent a lot of time growing up at the History Museum, and about 11 years ago now, which is crazy to think about, I decided that I wanted to know how Keppel Street got its name. That's my last name, and I started doing research, and I just started learning about all of these other street names too, and I decided that I had to share the stories that I was learning. So I started a blog. I started it in June of 2009, so it'll be 11 years. You can find my blog at buffalostreets.com. And so today we're going to talk about a dozen streets. So the first street is Masten Avenue. Masten is a street on the east side of Buffalo. In addition to the street, the name is used for the Masten neighborhood, the Masten Council District, and the Masten Park High School, which is now City Honors. They're all named after the former City of Buffalo mayor, Joseph Masten. He also was a judge. Judge Joseph Griffiths Masten was born in Red Hook, New York in 1809. He studied at Trinity College in Connecticut, and then Union College in Schenectady, and then he studied law in Kingston, New York, before he came to Buffalo in 1836. He became the mayor of Buffalo in 1843. While he was the mayor, he issued the law that says the owners of buildings have to keep sidewalks free from snow. So he's the person you have to blame that you have to shovel your sidewalks. Just so you know, we got a little snow today, so hopefully the snow is done for the year though. After he was mayor, he held the title, he was a Superior Court judge for the Superior Court. Judge Masten and his wife were the first civilian residents of the Wilcox Mansion on Delaware Avenue. This building was originally an army barracks. The barracks were originally built in response to the 1837 Patriots War in Canada. At the time, Buffalonians still remembered the War of 1812 and when Buffalo was burned to the ground. And so there was some fear that the war in Canada would spread into the Niagara frontier here. So they built an army barracks. What we now know as this house was originally the officers' quarters. At the time, in 1845, the barracks moved from this place on Delaware Avenue over to Fort Porter by the Peace Bridge, and most of the buildings were dismantled. Judge Masten and his wife converted this officers' quarters into the house, and they lived here until 1863. This house, many of you probably recognize, is now the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. After the Mastens lived there, the house was owned by Ainsley Wilcox, and in 1901, this is where Teddy Roosevelt was inaugurated. Judge Masten was also one of the founding members of the medical school, which became the University of Buffalo, and was a founding member of what became Trinity Episcopal Church. He died in 1871. This is a picture of his grave, and he is buried in Forest Lawn. The next street I'm going to talk about is Dart Street. Dart Street is a small street on the west side of Buffalo. It runs between Forest Avenue and the Scajaquada, between Grant and Niagara Streets. It's kind of in a very industrial area, which is fitting because the man the street was named after helped Buffalo become the industrial powerhouse that it once was. It's named after Joseph Dart. Dart was born in Connecticut in 1799. He came to Buffalo in 1821 when the village had a population of about 1,800 people. He worked in the hat, cap, and fur business with Joseph Stocking. He expanded his business by learning to trade with the Native Americans. Around this time, the Erie Canal opened and the village started to really grow. And while time at the shop was slow, he would toy around with an idea for how to move grain from ships to land using a grain elevator. At the time, the grain was stored in piles, often outside or maybe with a makeshift structure. But if you think about piles of grain, if it gets wet, it gets moldy. You can get a lot of, rats and other vermin. So he thought there has to be a better way. So he toyed around with this idea, and in 1841, he completed his blueprints, and in 1842, he built the first grain elevator on the banks of the Buffalo River. The elevator was very successful, and the grain industry was able to build elevators all along the shore of the Buffalo Harbor and the Buffalo River. There is a historic marker located on the spot where the elevator was located. If you're down at the Erie Basin Marina, it's close to where the entrance to the marina is, between the Naval Park and the marina along that walkway. That's where you can find this marker. One thing that's really interesting is that Joseph Dart refused to patent the elevator. He felt that his invention should be a gift to all. So he made money from the elevator that he operated, but he didn't make money from the other people's elevators, which, if you think about, was pretty generous at that time. The modern elevators still use the same technology that he invented, with the grain, the buckets and the pulleys that dump the grain into the elevators. Now the modern ships are a bit more automated, and they use vacuum suction to fill the buckets to then dump into the silos. Which started in about 2006. But from 1842 until then, people were still scooping the grain, and there was the grain scoopers, all still using Mr. Dart's technology. Mr. Dart was also a very prominent member of Buffalo society. He was involved in the Buffalo Waterworks. He was a founder of the Buffalo Female Academy, which then became Buffalo Seminary. A member of the Historical Society, and he was very active in First Presbyterian Church. One thing that's interesting about the Darts is that their family owned the first piano in Buffalo. And if you think about it, Buffalo in like the 1840s was still a pioneer frontier village, and to ship a piano, probably from New York City, was quite an undertaking. So they had the first piano. Joseph died in 1879. This is a picture of his marker. He is also in Forest Lawn. Next is Nash Street. Nash Street is a one-block street near the Central Business District, between Broadway and Williams Street near Michigan. The street's less than a quarter mile long, but it's a really important street, particularly for the African-American history and the Michigan Avenue heritage corridor. The street was known as Potter Street until the 1850s. The street is named after Jesse Edward Nash Sr. Dr. Nash was one of the city's most prominent African-American citizens during the first half of the 20th century. Dr. Nash was born in Virginia in 1868. He worked as a farmhand, a blacksmith, a mason, and a boatman. And then at the ripe old age of 24, he came to Buffalo in 1892 to serve as the pastor of the Michigan Ave Baptist Church. He was pastor there from 1892 until he retired in 1953. Dr. Nash moved into 36 Potter Street, which is now 36 Nash Street, in 1926. The Nash family lived there until 1987. After Dr. Nash died, his wife still lived there, and then his son lived there up until the 80s. While they were living there, Michigan Avenue was the heart of the African-American neighborhood. The Nash house was visited by many prominent African-Americans at the time. Mary Talbert lived right around the corner. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, they were all guests at this home. Dr. Nash was well respected in both the Black and the white communities. So he became one of the main representatives for Buffalo's African-American community up through the Civil Rights era. The house was purchased by the Michigan Street Preservation Corporation in 2000. They restored it to the way it looked while Dr. Nash lived there. It's now open as a museum, and they preserved Dr. Nash's papers and legacy. You can visit the museum once we can go outside again. And the second floor is set up just the way it was when they lived there. It's a typical Buffalo upper lower, and they lived on the second floor. And then the first floor has some museum space, and it's a great group. I highly recommend going to visit. Dr. Nash retired as pastor in 1953. To commemorate his retirement, the city renamed the street from Potter Street to Nash Street. In 1954, Dr. Nash was awarded one of the first Brotherhood Awards from the National Conference of Christians and Jews. He passed away in 1956, and this is a picture of his grave, also in Forest Lawn. The next street I'm going to talk about is Spaulding Street. Spaulding Street is another small street, just 1 block long in South Buffalo. There's also a Spaulding Hall at UB. The street is named after Elbridge Jerry Spaulding, who was born in 1809 in Summerhill, New York. He studied law in Batavia at the firm of Harvey Putnam. He moved to Buffalo in 1834 and became a clerk in the office of Potter and Babcock, who were prominent Buffalo attorneys. He kept himself busy. In 1836, he was appointed city clerk of Buffalo. In 1841, he was alderman of the 3rd Ward. In 1846, he helped establish the University of Buffalo. 1847, he became mayor. 1848, he was elected to the New York State Assembly. And 1849, he was elected to Congress. Busy guy. While he was in Congress, the American government needed to print money to help to pay for the Civil War. At the time, all money was backed by gold or silver. Mr. Spaulding helped to introduce the idea of the greenback, that money is money because the government says it so, and they say that it's legal tender. So you'll notice that all money, says that it's legal tender. This bill was passed in 1862, and so Congressman Spaulding is often called the father of the greenback. After his retirement from Congress, he moved to an estate on Grand Island, which he called River Lawn. The boathouse he built is still standing. You can actually see it if you're along the river, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. He died in 1897, and this is a picture of his grave. Next is Letchworth Street. Letchworth Street is another small street. It's behind Buff State College, and the name is more often known for Letchworth State Park in Genesee County. They're both named after William Pryor Letchworth, who was born in 1823 in Brownville, New York. He was a partner in the firm of Pratt and Letchworth, which made the metal pieces for saddles and other leather goods. When he died, he left his house. He left his house and the land around it to the state to create a park. He left 1,000 acres to the state, and the park has since been expanded and now includes 6,000 acres. The house still stands. It's the Inn and Museum Glen Iris at Letchworth State Park. But after he retired, he stayed very busy. He served as the president of the New York State Board of Charities, president of the Buffalo Academy of Fine Arts, which we now know as the Albright Knox Art Museum. He was one of the main promoters of the removal of children from almshouses, and he worked tirelessly to improve the care for the insane and to separate juvenile prisoners from hardened criminals in the jails. His motto was to aim to do all possible good in the world, which I think is a good motto, and we should all try to do that. He died in 1910 at the age of 87, and this is a picture of his grave. Fuhrmann Boulevard is the next street I'm going to talk about. Fuhrmann Boulevard is the road that kind of runs along Route 5 on the Outer Harbor, kind of underneath and then alongside the Skyway. It's kind of a confusing road, but it's a road that's been there since the 1930s. But it is named after Louis Fuhrmann, who was born in 1868 on the east side of Buffalo. He was educated in the Buffalo public schools. He started working in the meatpacking industry. At the time, Buffalo's meatpacking industry was second in the country just to Chicago. It was a very large business. He learned the trade in Kansas City and then came back to Buffalo to open his own business on Clinton Street in 1892. In 1906, he was elected alderman for the 5th Ward. He was elected mayor in 1910. He was the first mayor of Buffalo to actually be born in Buffalo. He was also mayor during the first St. Patrick's Day parade. While he was mayor, there was still a heavy German influence in Buffalo. There were German newspapers and parks and streets named after many Germans. During the lead up to the start of World War I, the attitude towards Germans started to change. Parks started to be renamed. Some of the newspapers folded. And so he decided to start a St. Patrick's Day parade to kind of get away from the Germanness of his name. However, it didn't work. He was defeated in 1917 by George Buck, who was an Englishman. After he was mayor, Mayor Fuhrmann lived in the Wicks house on Jewett Parkway, which was the picture on the previous slide. Oops, there we go. That's the Wicks house. This is the house that is directly across the street from the Darwin Martin house. So if you're standing at the Darwin Martin house and you turn around, this is the house that you will see there. It was built by William Wicks of Green and Wicks Architects. It's on Jewett Parkway. After he was mayor, he went back to the meat business. He also served as the president of the Buffalo Baseball and Amusement Company and was a member of the Board of Education. He died in February of 1931, and this is a picture of his grave. Next is George Urban Boulevard. There's also an urban road in the city of Buffalo as well, and they are both named after George Urban Sr. George Urban Sr. came to Buffalo in 1835 at the age of 15 with the first wave of German settlers to come here. He worked in the department store called Colton's that was on Main Street, and he later opened a wholesale flour business at the corner of Genesee and Oak Streets. His son, George Urban Jr., entered the business in 1866. Together, he and his father built a mill across the street from their wholesale business. It was the first flour mill in Buffalo to use steel rollers instead of millstones. After George Jr. died, his son, George P. Urban, became president of the company. At the time, Buffalo had 7 flour mills and had become the milling capital of the United States, having surpassed Minneapolis. The business was eventually sold to Cargill. In March of 1994, the plant closed. It was very obsolete and outdated at the time. George Urban Jr. had built his family estate on Pine Ridge Road in Cheektowaga. The urban estate was about 9 acres. At the time, this was mostly farmland. In addition to the home, there was grape vineyards with 29 varieties of grapes, a pond that was stocked with fish. He filled his estate with flowers and trees, and the house still stands next to Villa Maria College. The Urban family also helped to bring the first incandescent light service to Buffalo on July 14th, 1881. The experiment consisted of 9 lamps along Ganson Street, which is a street down near the General Mills plant, if you're familiar with that area, where a lot of the grain elevators were. And so the experiment was successful, which allowed them to power their mills with electricity to increase their output and help their business be more successful. George was president of the Niagara Falls Electric Light and Power Company, president of the Buffalo Loan Trust and Safe Deposit, vice president of Buffalo General Electric Company, president of the Cataract Power and Conduit Co., director of several banks, as well as CEO of George Urban Flour. It is said that he worked right up until the day he died, which was in 1928 at the age of 78. This is a picture of George Urban Jr.'s grave, and the flour mill that they had established was unfortunately demolished in the 1990s. The next street I'm going to talk about is Lovejoy Street. This is a street on the east side of Buffalo. There's also the Lovejoy neighborhood that kind of circles around Lovejoy Street. One thing that I think is interesting about the street is that it used to connect through to the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood before those railroad tracks were put there. So if you look at the map, you can see if it had continued through, it would have went right through where Central Terminal is. And the street is named after Sarah and Henry Lovejoy. The Lovejoy family came to Buffalo around 1807. Sarah Lovejoy was killed during the burning of Buffalo by the British during the War of 1812. Henry was with his mother, and she ordered him to flee into the woods. He decided that instead of fleeing, he was going to grab his musket and march up Niagara Street and fight with the rest of the men, which is very brave. He was only 12 years old. So Sarah was alone in her home. She refused to leave her home. She didn't want to surrender her property. Margaret St. John, who lived across the street, she saw a Native American pull the curtains. Sarah was attacked and killed by their hatchets. The neighbors laid Sarah to rest on her bed. When the British returned 2 days later to burn the rest of the village down, the Lovejoy house was burned and Sarah's remains were also burned. She was the only woman killed during the Battle of Buffalo. This is a picture of her tombstone. She's not actually buried there because she burned in the house, but she does have a marker at Forest Lawn. So Henry grew up and he became a surveyor. He also served as Buffalo street commissioner. So he laid out a lot of the streets and ran a lot of the lot lines in the older parts of Buffalo. So I always like to mention him because he was very involved with some of the early streets of Buffalo. He also drew this map, which I think is a very interesting map. It's a survey of Black Rock. And it actually shows the Black Rock. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but right here, this is where the actual Black Rock was, that the neighborhood of Black Rock gets its name from. So the Peace Ridge kind of goes across right here. And this is the Niagara River running north. And that was where the actual Black Rock was. So I always like to see this map. But Henry died in 1872, and this is a picture of his tombstone. And if you notice, it says he was a soldier during the War of 1812 as a 12-year-old. So pretty cool. Next is Best Street. I always like to include this one because when I was growing up, I always thought it was the best street. And I always wondered why it wasn't that great of a street and why they called it Best Street. But it's named after William Best, who came to Buffalo in 1810. He was the first surveyor hired by the Buffalo government to lay out property lines in the streets. So he worked with Henry Lovejoy, and they worked together to lay out a lot of the early parts of Buffalo. William's son, Robert Hamilton Best, was a sheriff of Erie County from 1862 to 1864. The next street is Dodge Street. Dodge Street is a street in the Cold Springs neighborhood. There's also Dodge Road up in Amherst. When the Dodge family came to Buffalo in 1811, they were considered courageous because they lived on Main Street just north of Summer Street. The area was well outside of the village and into the forests. So there was high risk that they would be attacked by Native Americans, and was what people said. But then when the village was actually attacked in 1813, their location seemed a little more strategic, and they took in many of the people as they were fleeing from the village of Buffalo. So Alvin Leonard Dodge, when he arrived in Buffalo with his family, he was 3. He was educated in a one-room schoolhouse on Ferry Street. This is a picture of the house just before it was demolished in the 1930s. One thing that's interesting about this school and Alvin Dodge was that his teacher, when he went to this school for one term, was Millard Fillmore. So Millard Fillmore worked as a teacher while he was studying law, and this is the school where he taught. So Mr. Dodge had acquired a farm that was several hundred acres in size. It was bounded by Main, East Ferry, Best, and Jefferson. He built his house at the corner of Main and Dodge using lumber that he had cleared from the land. He sold part of the land to the city of Buffalo in 1880. That actually became a reservoir, which they used for water service. In 1915, when the Colonel Ward pumping station opened, it rendered this reservoir obsolete. So in the 1920s, the reservoir was replaced by Buffalo Civic Stadium, better known as War Memorial Stadium or the Rock Pile, because it seemed to come out of the quarried rock that had formed the reservoir years before. So Alvin's brother, J. Wayne Dodge, moved to Williamsville. They purchased a mill across the creek from the Williamsville mill that is still standing today. So if you're in Glen Falls Park, you can see some of the foundations of the Dodge mill across on the banks of Ellicott Creek through there. This is a picture of the mill that was there. So he owned this flour and grease mill. He changed the name to Dodge Roller Mills. He owned it for many years, and that's Dodge Road in Amherst is named after J. Wayne Dodge. Alvin Dodge died in 1881 at the age of 73. When he died, the Buffalo Courier said his life was quiet and relatively uneventful, yet his life was the history of Buffalo. He lived to see the frontier village develop into an industrial powerhouse. So just the 80 years that he had lived there, it went from being really the frontier to really being the 9th largest city in America. And so he had really seen everything change, and we're probably seeing a lot of change right now as well. So that's what I have for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me at buffalostreets@gmail.com. One of my favorite things about giving these talks is the interaction. So I'd really love to hear from you. Send me an email. Tell me about your favorite street. Tell me where you grew up. I'd love to hear.
Angela, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I feel like I was taking notes. Like, there used to be a forest near Summer Street. That blows my mind. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, all of Buffalo was forested. Yeah.
I mean, of course, but that's so inconceivable for me right now. So I'm so appreciative for your time. Everybody who's watching this, we're trying to reach you as best we can while we're dealing with all of these changes and circumstances. But thank you to all of you, and just stay well, stay safe, and hopefully we'll connect again in some way. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.